Hello and welcome to another episode of the Halloween Podcast. I am your host, Lyle Perez, and you're listening to episode 34 of our special series, The Dark Record, where we uncover history's eeriest stories, one strange and unsettling case at a time. In the winter of 1803, the streets of Hammersmith, a small village just outside of London, were gripped by fear. Rumors spread of a ghostly figure haunting the lanes and churchyard, white, pale, and terrifying to all who crossed its path. Night after night, sightings mounted. Some said it was the spirit of a suicide, doomed to wander. Others swore it was something more sinister. Then, on a cold January evening, fear turned fatal. A man patrolling the streets with a loaded pistol confronted what he thought was the ghost. He pulled the trigger, only to discover, too late, that he had killed an innocent man. The next entry into the dark record, the Hammersmith Ghost murder. Let's begin. The story begins in late 1803 in the parish of Hammersmith, then a semi-rural district on the outskirts of London. It was the kind of place where gas lamps barely cut through the mist, and neighbors relied more on gossip and shared fears than on any organized authority. In December of that year, whispers began to spread that a ghost was roaming the streets after dark. Witnesses described a tall figure clad in white, sometimes glowing, sometimes with horns or fiery eyes. To a community steeped in folklore, these tales were terrifying but believable. The figure was said to appear suddenly, lurking near churchyards or following travelers on lonely paths. Some claimed the ghost would spring from the shadows to seize victims by the throat. A man named Thomas Groom later testified that he and a companion had been walking near the churchyard when the apparition attacked him, choking him before vanishing into the night. Groom survived, but his story fueled the spreading hysteria. Other accounts were even more dramatic. 2 women reportedly collapsed from fright after encountering the specter, and one, heavily pregnant, later died from the shock. A wagon driver described his horses panicking at the sight of a glowing figure by the roadside. Each tale added weight to the belief that something supernatural stalked Hammersmith. At the time, London did not yet have a centralized police force. Law and order in communities like Hammersmith were maintained largely by local watchmen and citizen patrols. With fear mounting, residents organized nightly groups to hunt the ghost. Men armed themselves with clubs, swords, and pistols, determined to protect their families and put an end to the haunting. But their fear made them dangerous. The ghost, they believed, could be a restless spirit, a suicide buried in unconsecrated ground, doomed to walk at night. That story, circulating widely, gave supernatural legitimacy to the sightings. Yet some skeptics suggested a more earthly explanation, a prankster draped in sheets, frightening passers-by for sport. Both ideas stoked the same response. Whether supernatural or human trickster, the ghost was a threat that had to be confronted. As December gave way to January, the patrols grew bolder. Neighbors prowled the foggy lanes in search of their quarry, nerves on edge, every shadow a potential phantom. The community's imagination had transformed the ordinary into the spectral. In that heightened atmosphere, it was only a matter of time before someone mistook a living man for the dreaded ghost and pulled the trigger. On the night of January 3rd, 1804, the hunt for the ghost reached its breaking point. A group of local men, armed and anxious, gathered in the streets of Hammersmith. Among them was Francis Smith, a 29-year-old excise officer. He had been unsettled by weeks of ghost stories, and like many of his neighbors, he was determined to protect his community. The mist hung thick that night, and every shadow seemed to conceal the figure that had been tormenting Hammersmith. Smith was not alone. William Girdler, a watchman, patrolled nearby, and together they resolved to confront the phantom if it appeared. They had convinced themselves that the ghost was real, dangerous, and possibly responsible for more than just fright. To them, this was not mere superstition. It was a menace that had already driven neighbors into fits, injured travelers, and even caused deaths from shock. Their nerves were strung as tight as the trigger on Smith's musket. As Smith walked along Black Lion Lane, he spotted a figure in white emerging from the shadows. In the half-light, the shape matched perfectly with the descriptions that had haunted the village for weeks. Smith raised his weapon and shouted, demanding that the figure identify itself. There was no reply. The man before him continued to move, his clothes pale and ghost-like in the darkness. Smith called out again. Still no answer. Panic overwhelmed reason. Convinced he faced the ghost, Smith pulled the trigger. The musket roared, and the figure crumpled to the ground. When Smith and others rushed forward, the grim truth became clear. This was no specter. It was Thomas Millwood, a local bricklayer. Millwood was dressed in his work clothes, a white linen shirt, white trousers, and a white apron. Practical attire for a mason, but tragically similar to the ghostly descriptions circulating through Hammersmith. His family later testified that neighbors had already warned him his clothing made him a target. He had even been advised to wear a greatcoat over his pale garments when walking at night. Millwood had ignored the warning. That night, it cost him his life. The community reeled. Millwood's widow and family were devastated, and the shock of the killing rippled through London. The haunting of Hammersmith had turned from a tale of folklore into a very real tragedy. A man was dead, shot down not by a supernatural force, but by fear itself. Francis Smith was arrested and charged with murder. The case would draw national attention, not only for its sensational connection to the so-called ghost, but for the legal question at its heart. What happens when someone kills in the sincere belief that they are confronting something dangerous, even if that belief is utterly mistaken?
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to Bombas.com and use code AUDIO for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com and use code AUDIO at checkout.
The ghost of Hammersmith had vanished into rumor, but the trial of Francis Smith was just beginning. The trial of Francis Smith began quickly, as the killing of Thomas Millwood had shocked not only Hammersmith, but all of London. What had started as a community's fear of a ghost had ended with the death of an innocent man, and the courts were left to decide how justice should be served. Smith admitted to firing the fatal shot, but his defense rested on his belief that Millwood was the ghost haunting Hammersmith. He claimed he had acted to protect himself and his neighbors from what he thought was a supernatural assailant. Witnesses testified to the hysteria that had gripped the district. Stories of glowing figures, attacks, and people collapsing from fright. It was clear that Smith's actions were shaped by the atmosphere of fear that had consumed the parish. But the law demanded more than fear. At the time, English common law required that self-defense be based on a reasonable belief of imminent danger. The problem was clear. Could a mistaken belief in a ghost ever be considered reasonable? The judge's answer was unequivocal. He instructed the jury that mistaken identity, especially one based on superstition, was no defense to murder. In his words, "It is not sufficient to say that you believed you were facing danger, if, in truth, no danger existed. If Smith intended to shoot what he thought was a ghost, then he had deliberately fired upon something he believed to be a human form. That, the court ruled, was murder." The jury initially wavered. They returned a verdict of manslaughter, suggesting they saw Smith as reckless, but not a cold-blooded killer. The judge rejected it outright, ordering them to deliberate again. Forced to reconsider under the judge's instructions, the jury found Smith guilty of murder. The sentence was death by hanging and dissection, a grim fate common in the early 19th century. For days, Smith faced the prospect of the gallows, his case the talk of London. Many sympathized with him, seeing not malice but fear behind his actions. Others argued that law and order had to prevail. If mistaken belief were allowed as a defense, chaos could follow. King George III himself intervened, commuting Smith's sentence to 1 year of hard labor. It was an act of mercy, recognizing the unusual circumstances of the case while upholding the legal precedent set by the court. Smith would live, but his name was forever tied to the Hammersmith Ghost and the deadly consequences of superstition. The legal impact was lasting. For nearly 180 years, the case stood as a precedent in English law. A mistaken belief could not excuse an unlawful killing. It wasn't until 1983, in the case of R.V. Williams, that the courts refined this doctrine, ruling that an honest belief, reasonable or not, could sometimes provide a defense. The Hammersmith Ghost murder case, however, remained the earliest and most famous example of how folklore, fear, and law collided in the streets of London. In the weeks after Francis Smith's trial, Hammersmith slowly returned to uneasy calm. The nightly patrols ended, the panic began to fade, and people tried to put the tragedy behind them. But soon, a revelation came to light that cast the whole affair in an even stranger, more tragic light. A local shoemaker named John Graham came forward and admitted that he had been dressing as the ghost. His motivation was not malicious, at least not in the way the townsfolk had imagined. Graham explained that his apprentices had been frightening his children with ghost stories, and to teach them a lesson, he had donned a white sheet and played the part of a specter, startling them in the lanes around Hammersmith. Whether his prank spiraled into the widespread panic or merely fed into it is hard to know. But his confession revealed that at least some of the ghostly sightings had been nothing more than a hoax. The irony was cruel. Millwood, the bricklayer, had lost his life because he looked like the ghost. Smith had nearly lost his to the gallows because he believed in it. And all the while, the phantom itself was a man in a sheet, playing tricks. The revelation underscored just how fragile the line between folklore and fear really was. A prank, layered over local superstition, had been enough to convince an entire community that the supernatural walked among them. But Graham's confession didn't undo the damage. Millwood was still dead. Smith had still stood trial for murder. Families had still been terrified, women had collapsed from fright, and men had patrolled the streets with weapons ready to fire. The story of the Hammersmith Ghost had already taken root, and in the telling, it no longer mattered whether Graham's prank explained all the sightings. Fear had filled in the gaps, and hysteria had magnified the threat until it seemed undeniable. This was not an isolated problem of the era. Across Britain in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, so-called ghost appearances, men in sheets, pranksters in masks, were a troubling trend. Many incidents ended with assaults, robberies, or even fatalities. These figures exploited superstition for mischief or profit, but their acts were deadly serious to those who believed. The Hammersmith case was the most famous example, but it was not unique. The lesson was grimly clear. The human imagination, once stirred by fear, could be as dangerous as any phantom. The Hammersmith Ghost murder case left scars far deeper than the grave of Thomas Millwood. It became a landmark in English legal history, a cautionary tale told in both law and folklore for centuries afterward. For the courts, the case set an important precedent. The ruling against Francis Smith established that a mistaken belief, no matter how sincerely held, could not justify the taking of a life. The judge's rejection of the jury's manslaughter verdict underscored the principle that belief in danger is not enough unless that belief is grounded in reality. This strict interpretation shaped English law for nearly 180 years. It wasn't until 1983, in the case of R. v. Williams, that the courts softened the standard, ruling that a person could sometimes be excused if they acted on an honest belief, even if that belief later proved unreasonable. But until then, the Hammersmith ruling stood as a stark warning. Fear is no defense for murder. Beyond the courtroom, the case seeped into the cultural fabric of England. The Hammersmith Ghost became part of London's ghost lore, retold in pamphlets, newspapers, and later Victorian ghost story collections. It joined the ranks of other spectral legends, phantoms that haunted churchyards, headless horsemen, and strange beings like Spring-Heeled Jack. In each telling, the story blurred the line between supernatural terror and human folly. The case also reflected the dangers of mass hysteria. What began as rumor and prank turned into nightly armed patrols, escalating until a man was shot dead. It revealed how quickly fear could spiral when communities lacked strong institutions to keep order. In 1803, London had no modern police force, only watchmen and volunteers. Without authority to manage the panic, the people of Hammersmith created their own vigilante patrols, which in the end proved more dangerous than the ghost itself. Today, historians and legal scholars still revisit the case, not only for its strange blend of ghost story and homicide, but for what it reveals about human psychology. Belief in the supernatural, even without proof, can influence actions in ways that change lives, and sometimes end them. The Hammersmith Ghost may have been nothing more than a man in a sheet, but its legacy shows how fear can shape both society and the law.
You buy a pair of socks, that's 2 socks. You buy a pair of Bombas socks, that's 4 socks. Because one purchased is one donated. Socks are the #1 most requested clothing item in homeless shelters. So when you buy a pair of super comfortable Bombas socks, you're also donating a pair. Bombas customers have powered over 150 million donations. So Bombas would like to thank you 150 million times. But we only have like 30 seconds. Go to bombas.com and use code AUDIO for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com and use code AUDIO at checkout.
What lingers most about the Hammersmith ghost murder case isn't the image of a white-clad figure on a foggy lane. It's the reminder of how fragile human judgment can be when fear takes hold. The people of Hammersmith didn't need a ghost to haunt them. Their own imaginations did the job well enough. Francis Smith wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. He was an ordinary man caught in an extraordinary moment of panic. Surrounded by neighbors who swore the supernatural was at work, he patrolled the night armed and ready. When he saw a pale figure moving in the mist, his mind filled in the rest. To him, there was no bricklayer named Thomas Millwood, only the dreaded phantom that had terrified the parish for weeks. One mistaken belief, one panicked decision, and 2 lives were destroyed forever. What unsettles me is how easily we might have done the same. The line between reason and fear is thin, and once it breaks, judgment falters. In Hammersmith, people were primed to see a ghost. In that mindset, even a man in ordinary work clothes could appear monstrous. That tells us something profound about the power of belief, not in spirits themselves, but in the stories we tell about them. Belief, even when unfounded, can steer actions with deadly certainty. The law sought to restore balance. By holding Smith accountable, the court sent a message: fear is not an excuse for violence. And yet, the punishment was softened, his death sentence commuted to a year of hard labor. Even the king seemed to recognize that Smith had been less a murderer than a man swept up in hysteria. The tension between mercy and justice mirrors the tension at the heart of the case. The human struggle between what we think we see and what is truly there. The ghost of Hammersmith was never real, but the consequences were. And in that way, it stands as one of history's most chilling reminders that the most dangerous phantoms are not found in graveyards. They are born in our own minds. That brings us to the end of episode 34 of The Dark Record. We've walked the foggy streets of Hammersmith, where fear of a ghost ended in tragedy. A man mistaken for a specter was shot dead, and the trial that followed reshaped English law for nearly 2 centuries. It is a story that reminds us how superstition, once loosed upon a community, can be as deadly as any weapon, remembered, retold, and now added to the record. Next time, we turn to one of the strangest modern mysteries on American soil. In a quiet field in Georgia, a massive granite monument was raised in 1980, etched with cryptic commandments for a future world. Some saw it as a guide to survival, others as a harbinger of dark conspiracies. We'll explore the Georgia Guidestones. Until then, I'm Lyle Perez, and this has been the Halloween Podcast presenting The Dark Record. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It helps keep the show alive and weird. You can also explore sources, extras, and more at our Facebook page at facebook.com/The Halloween Podcast or at our website, thehalloweenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, keep your eyes on the shadows, and remember, sometimes it isn't the ghost we should fear, but the people who believe in it. Have a good night.
You buy a pair of socks, that's 2 socks. You buy a pair of Bombas socks, that's 4 socks. Because one purchased is one donated. Socks are the #1 most requested clothing item in homeless shelters. So when you buy a pair of super comfortable Bombas socks, you're also donating a pair. Bombas customers have powered over 150 million donations. So Bombas would like to thank you 150 million times. But we only have like 30 seconds. Go to bombas.com and use code AUDIO for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com and use code AUDIO at checkout.